Hi, this is David Douglas, Managing Director of EBO, the digital agency. EBO are the proud sponsors this year of Radio MoLI and MoLI's digital programme.
The 2025 Dedalus Lecture, an annual lecture held at MoLI on Bloomsday the 16th of June, was delivered by the novelist, essayist and critic Naoise Dolan. In her lecture, titled The Exophonic Ulysses, Dolan wove insights about multilingualism with an understanding of Joyce as a linguist, his love of Italian, French and Latin, and his more fraught relationship with Irish, before offering a broader reflection on adventures in multilingual writing. For more from Radio MoLI, visit radio.moli.ie.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. I hope you're all well. Happy Bloomsday to you all. I'm sure it's been a busy day for you all. My name is David Cleary. I'm the CEO and Director here at MoLI, and you're very welcome to MoLI's River Run of Language for the 2025 Dedalus Lecture. I hope you have had a really genuinely lovely Bloomsday. It's such a great day for people to come together and to celebrate Joyce and Ulysses. Every Bloomsday we invite a writer to give a lecture on a subject of their choice that intersects with the story of Joyce's Ulysses. To date, we've had some fascinating lectures from writers such as Paul Muldoon, Belinda McKeown and Fintan O'Toole, and I'm sure this evening's lecture by Naoise Dolan will be another voyage of discovery for us all. Before I introduce Naoise, I just want to remind you that our Bloomsday party kicks off after this lecture at 7 o'clock. You're all very welcome to stay around for the evening, so we hope you do so. Naoise Dolan is an Irish writer born in Dublin. She studied at Trinity College, followed by a master's in Victorian literature at Oxford. She writes fiction, essays, criticism and features for publications, including the London Review of Books, the Guardian and Vogue. Naoise's debut novel, Exciting Times, was published in 2020 and became a Sunday Times bestseller, widely translated and optioned for TV. Her second novel, The Happy Couple, was published in 2023 and was described by Graham Norton as ice cool, self-aware and very funny. Naoise has been shortlisted and longlisted for several prizes, including the Women's Prize for Fiction, the Dylan Thomas Prize and the Sunday Times Young Writer of the Year Award. We're very lucky that Naoise is living in Dublin at the moment as the inaugural iPut Writer in Residence, and are delighted to hear from Naoise for this year's Dedalus Lecture. Please welcome Naoise Dolan.
Well, not only am I allegedly very funny, self-aware and ice cool, but this evening only I also have a hat, so lucky you. Bonsoir à toutes et tous. Merci beaucoup d'être là. Bienvenidas y bienvenidos al mundo de Joyce. Es freut mich sehr, heute hier sein zu dürfen. Espero que anche voi possiate apprezzare o quantomeno tollerare le mie riflessioni su Ulisse e sulle lingue. Now, normally I would not be so utterly intolerable as to use all 6 of my languages in greeting an audience, but the title of this talk does kind of give me an in. You could also posit that I chose the title in order to engineer said in, but we will never know. That one's between me and God. But in any case, we're here to talk about exophonic writing and Ulysses. And if you're anything like me before you read Yoko Tawada's book, then your first question is, what does that word mean? I found it out by reading her book. So Yoko Tawada is a Japanese writer who moved to Germany several decades ago, started writing in German, including fiction, and has reflected deeply on what it means as a writer to leave your native tongue and the creative possibilities that this presents, not as a language exercise, not as a second best alternative, but as something that can free you and open you to new planes of thought that you could not have accessed if you stayed in your comfort zone. And so that's why she chooses the word exophonic. And here's what in her essay collection about this she describes as her reasoning for the word exophonic. In November of 2002, I participated in a symposium that took place in Dakar, Senegal. The symposium was sponsored by the Goethe Institute, as well as the Center for Literary Research in Berlin, and a number of writers and scholars from Germany, including myself, were invited to be in a dialogue with a group of Senegalese authors. It was there that I first heard the term exophonic writer from a scholar named Robert Stockhammer. I was familiar with similar terms, such as immigrant literature or Creole literature, but exophonic had a much broader meaning, referring to the general experience of existing outside of one's mother tongue. It isn't just immigrants who write in foreign languages, after all, and it's not always the case that the languages they write in are Creole. The world is far more complex than that. Now, you might be wondering, what does any of this have to do with Ulysses, a novel written in English by a native English speaker? But the shadow of language loss, I think, contours how we could read this book far more than the largely monolingual people studying it realize. And I think a lot of Joyce's inclusion of other languages is an attempt to grapple with not speaking Irish as an Irish person and to navigate the wounded pride and sense of national exclusion that come from that. And this is by no means exclusive to Joyce. If you ask most English language commentators to explain the strength of Irish literature, they'll go, well, we've had such a grand tradition, as far back as Wilde, as far back as Sheridan, and it's like there are kind of a few centuries before that, it just wasn't in English. So I think it's a question that you need to grapple with one way or another. You need to find a way to either dismiss the vast tradition that made us so good at writing in English, or you need to learn Irish and get in there. And the first one is a lot easier to do. And so that's what I'm going to be looking at as I talk about Ulysses before branching out generally into exophonic writing within English itself, and whether we have a way to at least constructively do damage to the language that most of us hate and most of us exclusively speak in this country. But before I start on that, I thought it might be helpful to give a quick plot summary of Ulysses, not because I would be so rude as to suggest that not everyone might have read it, but just like to be sure. So we've got a single day in Dublin, June 16th, 1904, which isn't actually confirmed within the text itself, but we all know from the foraging, whose events loosely parallel Odysseus' journey home after the Trojan War. And our three protagonists, the wandering, sensitive flower Stephen Dedalus and the married couple Leopold Bloom and MoLI Bloom, are broad counterparts, respectively, of Telemachus, Odysseus himself, and Penelope. And if these references themselves are Greek, or specifically Homeric Greek, to anyone, it actually doesn't matter at all. Ulysses is kind of a make-your-own adventure. And I am going to uphold one of my many hills that I would die on here and say it's actively helpful not to understand every reference in Ulysses, because it really helps the decision fatigue as to what to focus on if you interpret it. I think if you go in with one or two pet interests and make the whole thing about that, you're doing really great. If you actually know a lot and care a lot about every single thing in this novel, you will be as demented and as overwhelmed with knowledge as Joyce himself was. So much so that he had to write the thing, and God love him. So I do not think anyone needs a greatly deep knowledge of mythology to access or enjoy this book, and I don't think Joyce wrote it with such an audience in mind. My instinct, as a writer who does this quite often myself, is that his true purpose in latching onto mythology was just to give him some kind of framework or constraint, precisely because we've got such a vast mind operating, and if there's some kind of box that he can put himself into, it gives the thing some kind of limit and some kind of form. And I think in this respect of needing a constraint, and also his tricksterism, his sense that he's messing with you all the time, he's really a precursor of the Oulipo movement in France in the 1960s, who pushed this even further. And my favorite thing that they did was the N+7 method, where they would take an existing poem and then every substantive noun, they would replace that noun with the seventh noun after it in the dictionary, and that's the poem. So I think this tradition of trolling the reader a little bit is very much something that Joyce was setting up. And the beautiful thing is that it works, you're annoyed, but there is also literary value in it. And I think he takes that even further with Finnegan's Wake. On every page, you're like, oh, you are being intentionally so frustrating, but I'm also actually enjoying this. But in any case, using this springboard of the mythological constraint, we start at 8 in the morning with Stephen Dedalus collecting his pay at the boys' school where he teaches and wandering along the beach after conversing with his friends. And meanwhile, Bloom brings his wife breakfast in bed and then conducts various errands, including a funeral. And the rest of the plot is essentially Dublin. So we get journalists, we get a heated scholarly debate, we get a brothel, we get fisticuffs with a British soldier, we get an affair, and famously, we get a wank on the beach. Not a lot happens, people like to say about Ulysses, but I think what they mean is that the events to sentences ratio is low. It's still a lot higher, though, than the events to sentences ratio in our own lives. So per minute of talking, because the average human talking speed in English is around 160 words per minute. And because we're Irish, let's bump that up to 170. So per minute of talking, we would fill probably about half a page of a novel, assuming average font size, just with the literal words that we are exchanging. And that's leaving out our body language, that's leaving out what's happening in the background, that's leaving out the furniture, that's leaving out the smell, that's leaving out every other form of information that you need to understand what experience we are having. So if we assume that the literal words we're saying are 20% of the total sensory communication that we absorb in conversation, which according to studies is roughly the case, you pay 20% to the actual words and the rest is how the faces look and what's around you, etc., then we would need actually 850 words to sketch out a single minute of our lives, which is about 3 pages of a book. So by that metric, the 265,000 words in Ulysses would only cover about 5 hours of existence for one person, assuming that at the time they're not talking, the space taken up with those words they're exchanging is equally lengthy inside their heads or whatever you have. So the fact that Ulysses manages to portray an entire city with multiple characters, including multiple protagonists, over 19 hours, is actually fairly economical in the grand scheme of things, I would argue. The chaos is moderate compared to that which each of us navigates day to day. And so I think it's far more novel-y than it is lifelike. So if we were to chart this on some kind of spectrum, fine, maybe it's closer to the madness of human existence than actual traditional novels, but we're still way over here on the other side of that. I think the novels are very much grouped in this sense. And so it frustrates me a bit when people refer to this as an impenetrable mass of thought, when there's a very, very clear structure that Joyce chose, and there's a degree of discipline into what to include and what to exclude. But I think there is a difference, however, between making something as simple as you can and simplifying it, and he doesn't do that. And one of the ways that he doesn't simplify the experience of being in a modern city, albeit quite a small one within Europe, is you're going to hear languages besides English. So in terms of that linguistic variety, the most obvious form of it that we get is simply in the title. And why he chose Ulysses in Latin is, I think, a fairly open question. I couldn't find any source of him explicitly justifying that decision, perhaps because it seemed an obvious one to someone with a classical education. But we know that he was a lot more comfortable in Latin than in Greek from his time in Clongowes and Belvedere. And I think as well that comfort with Latin extends into his use of English prose. You don't really see him playing with Greek in Ulysses, whereas you do see him having a bit of fun with Latin, both in having people directly speak it and in copying its rhetorical structure to be funny in English. And I think as well, on some level, because he was conscious that this was going to be the novel that will be both widely enjoyed and very heavily debated, I wonder, did he have a mind for translatability? Because it does translate very well. So in Irish, you've got Wilches, in Italian, you've got Ulisse, in German, you've got Ulysses, so it's the same title, but just different pronunciation. In French, you've got Ulysse, and in Spanish, similar. So contrast that with the difficulties of Finnegan's Wake. So in Irish, you've got Fara of or Fara na Fionnagon, depending on how into the genitive you are. Then in French, they've just got Finnegan's Wake, although they probably pronounce it with half the consonants left out. In Italian, they've got Finnegan's Wake, but they probably pronounce it with several letters added at the end. And then Spanish, I find the most interesting in this. They've got either La Velada de Finnegan or they've got Estela de Finnegan. And Velada would be the more literal translation, but then Estela, it's the wake left by a ship, which I don't think is a word we have a single... I mean, people love to be so precious about, this word is a concept that you can't get across in another language. And I think a lot of the time they're being deliberately obtuse and the language just has a different way to say it. But I genuinely do not think there's a succinct way in English to say the shadow left by a ship. So well done on the Spaniards for inventing something to that. And then the German one isn't as interesting, but it's very fun to say. Finnegan's Wachen. So there's that. It places it as a European translatable text. But then it also links it to the rhetorical fun, like I was saying, that Joyce has with Latin. And there's an opening to the 14th episode that I just want to read from to illustrate what I mean. And this takes place in the Hall Street Maternity Hospital where Mina Purefoy is in labour. So, Deschel hollis amos, send us bright one, light one, horhorn, quickening and womb fruit. Send us bright one, light one, horhorn, quickening and womb fruit. Send us bright one, light one, horhorn, quickening and womb fruit. Hoopsa, boy, hoopsa. Hoopsa, boy, hoopsa. Hoopsa, boy, hoopsa. Universally, that person's acumen is esteemed very little perceptive concerning whatsoever matters are being held as most profitably by mortals with sapience endowed to be studied, who is ignorant of that which the most in doctrine and erudite, and certainly by reason of that, in them high minds ornament, deserving of veneration, constantly maintain, when, by general consent, they affirm that other circumstances, being equal, by no exterior splendour, is the prosperity of a nation more efficaciously asserted than by the measure of how far forward may have progressed the tribute of its solicitude for that proliferant continuance which the evils, the original, if it be absent when fortunately present, constitutes a certain sign of omnipotent nature's incorrupted benefaction. For who is there, if anything, of some significance has apprehended, but is conscious that the exterior splendour may be the surface of a downward-tending, lutulant reality, or on the contrary, anyone so is there unilluminated as not to perceive that, as no nature's boon can contend against the bounty of increase, so it behooves every most just citizen to become the exhortator and admonisher of his semblables, and to tremble, lest what had been in the past, been by the nation excellently commenced, might be in the future, not with similar excellence accomplished, if an inverecund habit shall have gradually traced the honourable by ancestors transmitted customs through that thither of profundity, that one was audaciously, excessively, who would have had the hardihood to rise, affirming that no more odious offence can for anyone be than the oblivious neglect to consign that evangel simultaneously command and promise, which shall not all mortals with prophecy of abundance or with diminutions menace that exalted, of reiteratedly procreating function, ever irrevocably enjoined. Is that not why, therefore, we shall wonder if, as the best historians relate, among the Celts, who nothing that was not in its nature admirable admired, the art of medicine shall have been highly honoured, not to speak of hostels, leper yards, sweating chambers, plague graves, their greatest doctors, the O'Shiels, the Hickeys, the O'Lees, have sedulously set down the diverse methods by which the sick and the relapsed found again health, whether the malady had been the trembling withering or loose boyconal flux. Certainly, in every public work, which, in it of anything of gravity contains preparation, should be with importance commensurate, and therefore a plan was by them adopted, whether by having preconsidered or as the maturation of experience, it is difficult to being said, which the discrepant opinions of subsequent inquirers are not up to the present congruent to render manifest. Whereby maternity was so far from all accident possibility removed, that whatever care the patient, in that all hardest of woman hour, chiefly required, and not solely for the copiously opulent, but also for her who, not being sufficiently moneyed, scarcely, and often not even scarcely, could subsist valiantly, and for an inconsiderable emolument was provided. To her nothing already then and thenceforth was anyway able to be molestful for this chiefly felt of citizens, except for proliferant mother's prosperity, at all, not to can be, and as they'd received eternity gods, mortals' generation to befit them her beholding, when the case was so hovering itself, parturient in vehicle, thereward carrying desire immense, among all another, was impelling on her to be received into that domicile. O thing of prudent nation, not merely in being seen, but also in being even related worthy of being praised, that they her by anticipation went seeing mother, that she by them suddenly to be about to be cherished, had been begun, she felt. Now, There are some languages I speak that if I've spoken them for too long, I get muscle pain. German is one because you need to articulate so clearly and there's all the ha. The ha in Irish also can tire me out after a bit. The road R's in Italian too. But in English, Joyce is the only writer who can do this to my mouth. So that is to his eternal credit anyway. But I think the interesting thing of his deployment of Latin here is that he's not just being satirical of verbal pomposity. There are many points in the text where he's just doing that. But here, you get the sense that on the same level, he actually thinks some of this stuff. He actually does think that childbirth is this noble and beautiful thing. But that's far too earnest a thing for a Dubliner to just say in Dublin English. And so he runs to this structure of Latin prose and does something clever enough that he can get his thoughts aside through those dressings. And I think Latin was the closest thing he had to a truly comfortable second language in this respect, not when he's directly writing in Latin, but when he's taking on Latin as a rhetorical costume. And something that's easy to forget now, I think, is how understandable that would have been to any educated person reading his text. He was riffing on things that they'd all intensely studied, and the Latinate roots of all these words would have been obvious to his peers. And so it's a way to not have to own what he's saying that I think falls in the grand Irish tradition of satire. But I was reading Alistair Daly on this. He's a classicist at TCD who wrote recently in a piece for RTE. To read Joyce is to be confronted with questions of language and identity, of what it means to belong to a nation. Latin was for Joyce a language between English and acquired speech, and Irish, what for? Which is a question that most of us with English-speaking boomer parents hear every time we mention the language in any way. And Joyce himself, falling into another grand national tradition, didn't speak Irish and blamed how it was taught to him. And he blamed no less august a party than Pádraig Pearse himself. He went to some Irish lessons, felt that it was too nationalistic and bombastic and too scathing of the supposed inferiority of the English tongue, and abandoned the whole endeavour and proceeded to have a tricky relationship with Irish for the rest of his writing career. The interesting thing in all this, though, is that his father certainly shared the bourgeois nationalist aspiration to speak Irish. He falsely put down on the census that both Joyce and his brother did when Joyce was 19 years old. And I mean, I suppose it's possible that Joyce secretly spoke Irish and was just uncharacteristically modest about this one thing, but I feel like if Joyce had spoken fluent Irish, we would have heard all about it, and we did not. But I think his tricky relationship with the language really comes through in Ulysses, and right from the first episode it does. So this is Stephen and a couple of his friends encountering an old woman, and one of these friends, Haynes, is English. "Is it French you are talking, sir?" the old woman said to Haynes. Haynes spoke to her again, a longer speech, confidently. "Irish," Buck Mulligan said. "Is there Gaelic on you?" "I thought it was Irish," she said, by the sound of it. "Are you from the West, sir?" "I'm an Englishman," Haynes answered. "He's English," Buck Mulligan said, "and he thinks we ought to speak Irish in Ireland." "Sure we ought to," the old woman said, "and I'm ashamed I don't speak the language myself. I'm told it's a grand language by them that knows." Now, what the English of this reveals, I think, is that these questions of who owns Irish are coloured by Irish English, because despite Haynes being the only person in this exchange who speaks the OG language, Buck Mulligan and the old woman are fluently and confidently using Irish English while Haynes is not. So when she says, "Is it French you are talking, sir?" she's using the syntactic flexibility of Irish, where you can rearrange things like that to emphasize. In standard English, you would have to say, "Are you speaking French?" You wouldn't have the alternative of putting, "Is it French you are talking?" And so if she were to try to learn Irish, she would have a much easier time mastering when you do and don't do that than Haynes, who presumably had to learn that in a completely abstract way because it's not native to the English that he speaks. Similarly, when Buck Mulligan says, "Is there Gaelic on you?" a lot of second language speakers of Irish who don't know Irish English very well would inappropriately use "do you speak Irish" literally translated, which
to someone fluent in Irish sounds like you're saying, like, are you currently speaking Irish? And so I think Irish English is this bridge to the language that we underestimate, and that I think Joyce is underestimating. I have no idea if he was conscious of what he was doing there, but to me, as someone who speaks both, it seems very much like a send-up of who's allowed into the language and who isn't, whoever even gets to decide that. But to come back to Pearse, I think another way that Joyce had this unnecessary wariness of Irishness is, in terms of thinking of writers moving outside their language, Irish is actually a fairly welcoming one, and Pearse is a really good example of this. I think we underestimate how cool it is that this person who in no way grew up speaking Irish was one of the most significant, not only contributors, but inventors of the modern tradition. Every time we sing the modern version of O Roche de Vahualia, we're quoting Pearse. And that's partly because there isn't this huge canonic, intimidating, novelistic tradition that there is in English. And so I cannot but torture myself with this what if Joyce hadn't been so put off by the lessons, or what if he hadn't found the grammar a bit hard and rationalised it as he hated nationalism, and what if Joyce had written a novel in Irish? But maybe that's me imposing my hobby horses on someone who just genuinely didn't care very much. But it set me thinking as well, in terms of Pearse, about a writer's idea of fluency compared to any normal person's, because I think a lot of Joyce's resistance to Irish wasn't that he thought it would be too hard to be able to speak it, but that speaking a language and being able to do interesting things in the language are two entirely different endeavours. And so if we define fluency in a practical sense of everything that you do in your first language, you can do in second languages, even if it's not quite as easy, for a writer, the bar of fluency is much higher than for anyone else on the planet, which is very unfair, but them's the breaks. I guess if you're going to be a wordsmith, you do need to be good at words. But I think the more you look then at other references to Irish in the text, the more you build a sense of denial that people are still speaking the language at all. So here's one in episode 10. Hell open to Christians they are having, Jimmy Henry said pettishly about their damned Irish language. Where was the marshal, he wanted to know, to keep order in the council chamber? And old Barlow, the mace-bearer, laid up with asthma, no mace on the table, nothing in order, no quorum even, and Hutchinson, the Lord Mayor, in Llandudno, and little Lorcan Sherlock doing locum tenens for him. Damned Irish language, language of our forefathers. And then again in episode 12, we got other characters going off like this. So then the citizen begins talking about the Irish language and the corporation meeting and all that, and the Shonines that can't speak their own language, and Joe chipping in because he stuck someone for a quid, and Bloom putting in his old goo with his 2-penny stump that he cadged off of Joe, and talking about the Gaelic League and the Anti-Treating League and drink, the curse of Ireland. Anti-treating is about the size of it. Gob. He'd let you pour all manner of drink down his throat till the Lord would call him before he'd even see the fraught of his pint. And one night I went in with a fellow into one of their musical evenings, song and dance about how she could get up with a truss of hay, she could my Maureen lay, and there was a fellow with a ballyhooly blue ribbon badge spiffing out of him in Irish, and a lot of Colleen Bones going about with temperance beverages and selling medals and oranges and lemonade, and a few old dry buns. Gob, Fulhul entertainment, don't be talking. Ireland sober is Ireland free. And then an old fellow starts blowing into his bagpipes and all the gougers shuffling their feet to the tune the old cow died of. And one or two sky pilots having an eye around that there was no goings-ons with the feelings, hitting below the belt. And these continued references to Irish as someone or other's political prop, someone or other's unwanted dead bird that they're leaving on someone's doorstep and then slinking off to go and catch and kill another. It makes me wonder, would it have killed him in a book so long to include one Irish speaker directly speaking Irish? But I think this abstraction of Irish to a political tool makes it much harder to avoid engaging with that. And there were Irish speakers in Dublin still, not as many as there are today, 14,000 today, but there are a few thousand at least. And many of them were people who defied this easy narrative of it being purely a bourgeois nationalist pastime if you had the luxury to go off and learn this useless language, because many of the people still speaking Irish in Dublin were descendants of people who had migrated there during the famine. And so I just wonder about this incuriosity and the undertone of aggression to it. And whether I'm reading too much into this or whether Joyce was wishing that he could have played with Irish like he played with Latin, while being aware that while playing with Irish English, he was essentially playing with Irish, but without understanding fully where it came from. And you do get hints of that. There's a slonleat thrown in, but by and large, these are all characters talking about Irish speakers, without really any direct interaction. And I think it's because Joyce didn't feel that he himself had the agency to do anything with Irish. He didn't have the agency to write dialogue that was dramatically interesting to him in Irish, and so easier to just leave it out. Which brings me to Italian, because the funny thing is how much more confident he was of his Italian, and that's funny for reasons I'll get into, but I'll just read you out a sample. So this is in episode 16, when Bloom and Stephen have finally met. The guarded glance of half solicitude, half curiosity, augmented by friendliness, which he gave at Stephen's, at present morose expression of features, did not throw a flood of light, none at all, in fact, on the problem as to whether he had let himself be badly bamboozled, to judge by 2 or 3 low-spirited remarks he let drop, or the other way about saw through the affair, and for some reason or other best known to himself, allowed matters to more or less. Grinding poverty did have that effect, and he more than conjectured that, high educational abilities though he possessed, he experienced no little difficulty in making both ends meet. Adjacent to the men's public urinal, they perceived an ice cream car, round which a group of presumably Italians in heated altercation were getting rid of voluble expressions in their vivacious language in a particularly animated way, there being some little differences between the parties. Puttana Madonna, che ci die quattrini, ho ragione culo rotto. Intentiamoci, mezzo sovrano più, dice lui però, mezzo, farà brutto, mortacci suoi, ma ascolta, 5 la testa più. Now, Joyce spoke Italian. He had lived in Trieste for many years. He had raised his children partly through Italian and given them Italian names. But if you ever want to check if a writer's command of a language was truly perfect and if they're widely translated, you can simply check out whether the person who translated them into the other language kept what they had written as is. Now, in Gianni Celati's translation, published in 2013 by Einaudi, here's what he did with those 6 lines of dialogue. So he compressed them into 5 because there was a bit where he couldn't understand what Joyce was trying to say, and so changed the meaning to pretty much the opposite. I think I understood what he was trying to say because I'm also a native English speaker, but Celati seems to have been confused and to have just decided, let's not deal with that one line. But here it is. Puttana Madonna, che ci die quattrini, ho ragione culo rotto. Intentiamoci, mezzo sovrano e niente di più. Dice lui però, farà butto, ma tace sua, ma ascolta, 5 la testa in più. So he hasn't rewritten it from scratch. Joyce did speak Italian, but in these 6 lines of dialogue, there are 3 distinct edits. So statistically, when Joyce writes a line of dialogue in Italian, there is a 50% chance that it will actually be correct. So how is he so much more confident in his Italian than in his Irish? And the easy reason is simply that he's lived through the language more and that this is his Italian, even if it's not exactly like the Italian that someone else might speak, Italians, for instance. But I think the other answer is that he knows there are very few people reading this who will catch that. And with Irish, I think people are conscious that there are just enough that you need to be careful. And if you are caught out, it's a lot more embarrassing than if you're caught out making a mistake in Italian because you have flubbed your own Irishness into the bargain. And so I think that scrutiny is another reason for his stepping away from Irish. And I do wonder at the same time, quite often, am I overcomplicating this? Is it just that Latinate languages are a lot easier for English native speakers than Irish is? I have had the thought once or twice cynically myself, I could have learned 4 Latinate languages in the time it took to learn Irish, and I managed to do both in the end, so it's not too big a curse in my existence, but I do think you see the gap between the two in the fact that it's not even that he was embodying Italian well enough to write in it on a native level, and yet couldn't take that step towards Irish, or didn't want to, and found all sorts of complicated intellectual reasons as to why that was the case, when I'm just sensing wounded pride. Maybe I'm projecting too much from my own boomer parents who have the same approach. In any case, exophonic writing in general, because I think it's something facing all Irish people, whether we want to talk about it or not. And many of us don't. Many of us want to leave unexamined the fact that we write in English. But I think it's a fair choice. It's one that I'm probably largely going to make myself. Besides English, I write mostly in Italian and increasingly in Irish too. But I have accepted that there will never be a language that I have as much stylistic control in as there is in English. I would have to stop using English at all for decades in order to get up to the same level in another language, because even if I were to improve my Italian and Irish, for as long as I keep doing things in English, I'm going to keep improving my English too. And so I would need to debilitate English and just cut it off entirely, and I don't know if I want to do that. But point being, it's still fun to consider, even if your conclusion is that you're going to keep writing in English. And so I'm trying to give it a level of consideration that I don't think Joyce did, and as a result, maybe to be at least more honest with myself on the question than I think that he was. And one thing I find fascinating when we talk about writers choosing English is that they really don't do it from a sense of reverence or respect or affection for the English. And I cannot blame them. I don't think anyone in this country can. But Nabokov, for instance, I think was quite open about the fact that it was about reaching a wider audience, and he lamented throughout his life that he would never be able to contribute to the beauty of his native Russian in the same way again. And what's interesting about him is we have this narrative of him as a self-taught language genius, when in fact he had nannies in English and French throughout his childhood, and the only language he tried to teach himself as an adult, German, he miserably failed at, and not unlike Joyce, proceeded to blame the language and, set up a proud tradition of Berlin expats doing just that. And I find that fascinating to contrast with Isherwood, who actually did speak decent German, despite being viewed as this, I suppose, superficial British expat who was just enjoying the fun of the city while it lasted and then skedaddled as soon as the Nazis came into power. But if you actually read his novels, there's enough very good, very idiomatic German scattered in there that he clearly either knew the language or found someone who did and had the respect to ask them instead of just guessing, which is what most Anglophone writers do when they bring in languages they don't actually speak. So it's interesting who gets categorized as a multilingual writer when their multilingualism is just the result of decisions that their parents made for them when they were small, versus who does the unlikely thing of going to Germany and actually learning German and still gets seen as this foppish dilettante. So the mythology that we have around Nabokov, I think we'd be better readers of his work if we cut it off and if we thought of him as someone who moved to English entirely for practical reasons rather than a lover of the language, because he certainly had no great affection for it himself. And so I wonder if, as English speakers, we are being self-flattering in framing it as something that he did for the artistic achievement of writing good English, because he was certainly clear throughout his life that good English is never going to be nearly as beautiful as good Russian. But I found an interesting article in The Guardian from the writer Jacob Milkanovsky, which backs me up on this. And what he writes is, "My first language was Polish. I learned it from my parents at home. English followed shortly at school in Pennsylvania. I learned to speak it fluently, but with an accent, which took years of teasing, and some speech therapy, kindly provided by the state, to wear away. That, combined with the experience of watching the widespread condescension towards those who take their time learning English, left me with a lifelong English skeptic. I admit also that the strain of linguistic megalomania runs through many Polish speakers, one best summed up by the novelist Joseph Conrad, who, when asked why he didn't write in his native language, replied, 'I value too much our beautiful Polish literature to introduce into it my worthless twaddle, but for Englishmen my capacities are just sufficient.'" Which echoes so many Slavic native speakers I know about their approach to English, but I once won the begrudging respect of a Slovak linguist because we were talking about English and he's saying, "Oh, it's such a stupid language, doesn't even have cases really anymore." And I told him Irish has 5, and he's like, "This is a proper language." And I asked him, did he think German was a proper language? And he said, "No, it's only got 4, it's not a proper language." So it's good to know that in the Slavic mind, 5 is the point where you become a proper language. And so we must not lose the vocative in Irish, because otherwise we will fall in this man's esteem. But the article continues, It's not that English is bad, it's fine. A perfectly nice language, capable of expressing a great many things, and with scores of fascinating regional variants from Scots to Singapore English. But it is so prevalent and so hard to escape, and so freighted with buffoonish puffery written on its behalf, our magnificent bastard tongue, the language that connects the world. Please, there is no reason for any particular language to be worshipped around the world like a golden idol. There is a pervasive mismatch between the grand claims made on English's behalf and its limitations as a means of communication. Limitations, to be fair, that it shares with all other languages. I find this a very satisfying paragraph because if you've lived in continental Europe long enough, you get to know a certain kind of English person who say with this tone of pride that they can get by with just English because everyone speaks it. Like they personally did that. They personally foisted their language on everyone and now gets to enjoy the linguistic service of everyone around them. Like, we benefit from a lucky coincidence, but the idea that we're part of something great in not having to learn languages is unfortunate. But then someone else I wanted to consider on exophonic writing is my Italian translator, Claudia Durastanti, who I find a fascinating person to talk to about these things because she's one of those slightly linguistically homeless people because she grew up in Brooklyn in the 1980s in a working-class Italian community, and so she has a fantastic accent in English, a proper Brooklyn, and then moved to the deep south of Italy, the Basilicata, and so also has a fantastic accent in Italian. But so just has parts of herself in each of those languages and isn't fully proficient in either, in the sense that either can contain all of her. She still kicks all of our asses in both of them, obviously, but in terms of containing the entire complexity of Claudia, she doesn't have a language. And this is what she said about why she doesn't write in English, despite it being much more profitable than Italian, in an interview in the Paris Review. There are a lot of writers who at some point decide to make the switch, to experiment in a new language, something I always admire as an effort. The first part of that switch is mastering the landing language, which in this case is English. Being such a powerful, dominant language, English requires a standard that can be pretty suffocating. It's no wonder that the experimenters within the English language right now come from undercurrent languages, Irish English speakers, for example, which brings something else. English itself is cracking up. When I write in English, I'm making the reverse journey from what I'm used to, English to Italian, so I'm obsessed with correctness. But then I don't think it's good writing. Usually when you allow yourself impurities, the writing is actually stronger. I'm not interested in using English as an expressive language if it has to be the most polite and polished version. I think that is a sacrifice. So to bring ultimately all these threads back to the question of Joyce, is that true? Is Irish English this way to write in English without suffocating under the pomposity of it all? And there are two different approaches to this, I think. So one, I want to quote from Yoko Tawada, the Japanese woman who writes in German. However, since few people can read literature written in minor languages, most of the time it ends up getting translated into languages that more people can read, at which point the vocabulary of the language is that it is dying out, its rhythms of thought, its way of telling stories, its images and myths, seeks refuge in the major language, becoming dislocated, disoriented, and unsettled. But nothing could be more stimulating to literature than this, which is why translated literature becomes a vehicle for the transformation of major languages. When writers who speak a minor language as their mother tongue begin to write in English or another major language, it causes a shift to occur in the major language. And this is not limited to language in the narrow sense of the term. The specific angle from which one regards history, the sensory systems that capture magical things, all of this enters into the language of literature. People from smaller communities have an easier time avoiding the danger of regarding history from the vantage point of the victors. At the same time, magic often manifests itself in minor languages in different ways due to temporal and qualitative lags stemming from the smaller community's pace of industrialization. So this broadly is the optimistic view. This is the view that says, if I say, it's this speech that I'm giving rather than I'm giving this speech, I'm capturing the exact same emphatic nuance that I would have had I used that syntax in Irish. And in saying it in English, I'm not losing anything that would have been lost had I spoken Irish in the first place. And by this understanding that moving to the major language can embody the subjectivity of the one that you're on some level translating from, we're okay. We don't need to worry about whether Irish language literature itself survives because we've successfully downloaded all of its patterns into the way that this country uses English. Major difficulty with this, though, is that Irish English itself is diminishing. It's becoming much less common that I would say it's this speech that I'm giving. And I think some of that is due to lack of direct contact with the Irish language itself. But it's not just that, because I think actually people of my generation, on average, have more contact with Irish than they did 100 years ago, say. Apart from anything else, it's much easier to because of the internet, and also we don't have the last generation's hang-ups. We don't worry that we'll be perceived as terrorists or backwards for being interested in a language. Ridiculous that anyone ever did, but I don't think that's something that haunts people. I think at worst they're just embarrassed if they don't speak it well. So it's not necessarily that, but I think the relentless globalization of the English language is slowly but surely bulldozing Irish English. That's not to say it's dead. That's not even to say that it's dying. But I don't think it's going to be a self-sustaining organism. I don't think that just by writing very well in Irish English, we are going to maintain all of our country's unique non-Anglophone subjectivity. And so my conclusion would be that if we don't have Irish language novels like this, we will ultimately lose out, and that therefore we lost out that Ulysses was written in English, even though we gained so much else. I think it was English's gain and Irish's loss that it was written in English. Now, we could say none of us owes the Irish language anything, but in as much as we have a desire to not be American, to not be English, it's just a pity if we make all our bets on the English language and let that carry the entirety of Irish thought. And so the second voice that I want to bring into this is Martin O'Kane, and what he said on the matter was, If we lose Irish, we lose any native literature. There wouldn't be any literature but English or American literature. Now, I know this is something that people are going to bristle at. I know it sounds exclusionary or dismissive of the many Irish writers working primarily in English, including myself. And so I'm going to be diplomatic and say I think the truth is maybe in between. I don't think that writing in Irish English is the same thing as writing American or English literature yet. But I do think that the reason that's the case is that there's enough Irish language life in this country that our English can successfully feed off that and be different. And so for me personally anyway, even when I'm writing in English, the escape from that into other languages is part of what makes me confident that I'm not just contributing to an Anglo-American tradition. And I think that contact is part of what makes exophonic such an expansive term. And that's ultimately why I think Joyce falls under it, because Ulysses, like I said at the start, is an English language novel written by an English native speaker, but it's also a novel that could not have been written in the same way if he were truly monolingual. And that's something that Tawada stresses in her novel, in her essay collection itself, that often the most multilingual writers are the ones who cannot keep their native language screened off from other languages and who portray that influence whichever language they write in. And so the conclusion that I've been very gradually circling towards is that Joyce's multilingualism might be complicated. He might have had a difficult relationship with Irish, a vibrant, if not entirely accurate one with Italian, and a love of Latin that I think pertains to a certain kind of person at a certain point in history that is no longer socially acceptable, and that's probably for the best. But I think we should celebrate this as a multilingual text, not just as an achievement for English literature, but an achievement for how our minds expand when we let new languages in. And so that is my perhaps corny, perhaps sappy conclusion. Yay for languages. Thank you.